Okay, so I think in the last video I said we were done with chapter 5 and I was wrong. There's one more thing we need to discuss. Sorry about that. Now that we know how to factor, of course we come back full circle to solving equations, right? That's probably one of the single biggest things we do with mathematics to solve equations. So let's take a look at that. Let's see how all this factoring gets it done. And it really does set the stage for a lot of mathematics in our future. So to begin with, here's an equation, right? I'm claiming that one expression is equal to another. So 2x squared plus 3x minus 5 equals 0. So remember what it means to solve an equation, right? What we have to do is we got to find a value. Maybe there's more, right? So values of the variable. And so in this case, x. We sub a value in, and what we get is a true statement. Okay, so the essence of solving. So we got to find a value that when I plug it in gives me a true statement. So that's basically what we need to do with this equation. What values of x can I put in there and equal 0? Now, of course, because of the way this is written, you could guess, right? You could sit here all day and you can guess. And, that's problematic because there's an infinite number of things to guess. And then you never really know when you're done, right? When you find one, if there's another? When you find two of them, is there a third? We don't really know. And so that's why we use algebra, all right? Algebra will give us a way to find a value that when I sub it in, gives us a true statement, all right? So let's see how we're going to use all this factoring stuff. Well, it turns out there's a very famous property that has a lot of different names, but I like to call it the zero factor property. I playfully call it ZFP for short. And in mathematics, here's what it says. It says that if A times B is equal to 0, then one of the things has to be true. The A is 0 or the B is 0. And so that's what mathematically the zero factor property says. So if I have a product and it's equal to 0, then we can safely assume that A is 0 or B is 0. Okay? And, in general, what we're basically saying, I just said that, right? So if I have a product equal to 0, so imagine, there's my two hands, and I'm trying to be secretive with you, right? I'm saying that there's a number in my right hand and a number in my left hand. And the only clue that I give you is that if I multiply these two numbers together, what we get is 0. Right? And so what can you safely assume about what's in my right or what's in my left hand? Well, something has to be 0. Maybe what's in my right hand is 0. Maybe what's in my left hand is 0. But somebody has to be 0 because it's the only way that I can multiply two numbers and get 0. Right? Anything times 0 is 0. And so that's basically what the zero factor property is saying. So left hand and right hand, right? If I multiply them together, I get 0. So what has to happen? Well, maybe what's in my left hand is 0, or maybe what's in my right hand is 0. Somebody has to be 0. That way the product is 0, right? Because again, we know anything. 5 times 0 is 0. 0 times 5 is 0, right? 0 times 0 is 0. So somebody has to be 0. Maybe it's B, maybe it's A, maybe it's both of them, but somebody has to be 0. And that pretty much that's the engine that drives all this stuff. So, for example, in the number one example I have, notice that I have a product. All right, I've got the factor x plus 2 times the factor x minus 3. And this product is equal to 0. So what does the ZFP say? Well, maybe the x plus 2 is 0, or maybe the x minus 3 is 0. One of these two, right? The left hand is 0 or the right hand is 0. Somebody has to be 0. And by doing that, we now have little mini equations to solve, right? Subtract 2 from both sides, and one of my solutions is negative 2. Add 3 to both sides, and one of my solutions is 3. So what's nice about this is these are the only two, right? Because I'm using algebra, I know these two values out of all the world of mathematics, right? All the infinite numbers, these are the only two that make this equation true. So how do I check to see? Let's sub them in. Let me try the 3. So if I put a 3 in here, we get 3 plus 2, and we get 3 minus 3, and lo and behold, that's 5 times 0, which is 0. All right, so this checks out. If we did the negative 2, right, negative 2 plus 2 negative 2 minus 3, this would give us 0, right, times negative 5, which is 0. So that checks out. So the zero factor property, if I have a product equal to 0, one of my factors has to be 0, and then we're basically back to solving things. You usually end up with a linear equation to solve. All right, usually. All right, in more harder situations, you end up with another polynomial, but we'll do those later. All right, so it even works if I have 3 factors, right? So here's a factor, and there's a factor, but when I multiply these factors together, what I get is 0. So what does the ZFP say? Well, 2x has to be 0, or the x plus 1 has to be 0, or the x minus 4 has to be 0. One of these 3 factors has to be 0. It's the only way a product is equal to 0. And so now we can solve. Right here, I divide both sides by 2, and one of my solutions is x equals 0. Subtract 1, and one of my solutions is negative 1. Add 4, and one of my solutions is 4. So this equation has 3 solutions, and mathematically, because we approached it that way, those are the only 3 that work. So again, you can check it out. If I put a 0 in here, 2 times 0 is 0. That's 1, that's negative 4. 0 times 1 times negative 4. Well, anything times 0 is 0. Right? If I try putting a 4 in there, 2 times 4 is 8. Right? 4 plus 1 is 5. And then 4 minus 4 is 0. Right? And so 40 times 0 is 0. And negative 1 will check out as well. So again, you're finding a value that when you sub it in, gives you a true statement. Zero factor property is the big guy that helps us solve a polynomial equation like this guy, right? So this was the one that we started off with. How do I solve that? Well, if we follow what we did down here, I got to figure out, right, what times what creates this trinomial. And hopefully you guys can now see why we did all that factoring. If I'm a guesser and a checker, right, what I'm thinking is, well, if the first term is 2x squared, so that's a 2x and an x, and the last term is a 5, so perhaps a 5 and a minus 2. Or excuse me, a 1 there. Sorry about that. First times first is first, and last times last is last. To check, right, we get a 5x in the middle and a negative 2x, which gives us a positive 3x. So there's my factorization. And so now that I have a factor and a factor equal to 0, I now have my zero factor property in play. One of these guys, maybe the 2x plus 5, or maybe the x minus 1. One of those two things has to be 0 to solve that equation. And of course, here we would subtract the 5, and then divide by 2. And so one of my solutions is negative 5 halves. Here we add 1 to both sides, and one of my solutions is 1. All right, and so that basically these two equations, or excuse me, these two values are what make that true. To check, right, let me check the hard one. So 2, if we put negative 5 halves squared in there, plus 3 times negative 5 halves, I'm equal to 0. Right, well, this would be 2 times 25 over 4. This would be a negative 15 over 2, and then we're subtracting 5. 2's cancel out, giving us 25 over 2. Right, plus a negative 15 over 2, and how about we rewrite that as a negative 10 over 2 equals 0, right? And so these two are negative, so you get 25 over 2 minus 25 over 2, and there's our 0 equals 0. So it works, all right? And so the heart and soul, the engine that drives polynomial equations, right? I probably should have said that up here too, right? What we're doing is solving polynomial equations. The engine that drives that is the zero factor property. You set one side equal to 0, factor your polynomial using the skills that we learned. Zero factor property says one of these two guys is 0, and then you solve, and then you can check it. For the next part of the module, I'm just going to concentrate on finding the value, right? Because we can always check it by subbing or just looking at that back of the book. All right, so I'll focus on that, but a good review of what it means to solve an equation, introducing us to this idea of the zero factor property, and then using it in situations. And that's what you're going to see in the next set of videos.